Welcome to The Populist. This is Kevin O'Hare. So, this week's podcast actually is going to have two parts. So, episode 5 and episode 6 you will need to listen to for this week's class material. Episode 5 is going to discuss defining democracy. And to do this, I interview Professor Craig Kauffman from here at the University of Oregon. And we're going to draw on the Schumpeter, Przeworski, and Diamond articles that are assigned for this week. It also goes along nicely with the textbook. So we're going to talk about the classical, the minimalist or procedural, and maximalist or substantive definitions of democracy. We'll go into some history about how they came about, and then we'll also get into the meat of it, which is how these definitions are different. Okay, because that's important to understand the difference between the minimalist and maximalist definitions of democracy. The second episode, episode 6, kind of continues this but asks questions like, how do countries become democratic? What are transitions to democracy like? And then what is democratic consolidation? All right, so again, make sure that you're listening to both of these episodes for this week. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Professor Craig Kauffman. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to The Populist, episode 5. I even named the podcast. I've got a guest here today. This is Professor Craig Kauffman. He's an associate professor of political science here at the University of Oregon, and he is also participating faculty in environmental studies and Latin American studies, and he also teaches this exact same class, just in the face-to-face version where you actually go to a classroom and not the online version. So, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to be here.
Glad that you could make it. So, before we get into today's topic, which was democracy and really defining democracy, what are some of the misconceptions that you come across with students or people just in general when it comes to democracy? What are these things floating in their head they think it is but are kind of misconceptions?
Yeah, I would answer that. I want to say, I guess, two things about that.
Okay.
Before I get into the real misconceptions, I guess I would point out that a lot of students' misconceptions aren't really misconceptions in the sense that a lot of students will have different associations of what democracy is or looks like.
Okay.
And they may not realize that that may be just one or two pieces in this basket of goods that may, and so, you know, when I hear the question, what I often see is that students think democracy is different things.
Okay.
Like different students will think democracy are different things, and I'm hestant to call them pure misconceptions because they're not wholly wrong. Like there are reasons why they have these associations, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit because this is a remnant of the fact that the definition of democracy has changed over time, right? And so that's one thing. You know, so I guess in terms of the misconception, so students are often maybe not aware, just haven't thought about the fact that democracy can really mean different things to different people, right?
Okay. Can you throw an example out there of something that would just something simple and short?
And not only the misconception is not only that democracy can mean different things to different people, but that different students might associate democracy with different features that are actually in conflict with one another, right? Okay. And that's one of the interesting things about democracy is it has associations with different things that are actually in conflict with one another. And I'll give you an example, right? So a lot of people might just intuitively think, oh, democracy is about majority rule, right? Or rule by the people, majority.
Sure.
And those two things tend to can get conflated, right?
Right.
You let the people vote, you let majority rule. But of course, when we think about that for a second, if the if the majority said, people with blue eyes can't eat dinner in these restaurants, right?
Mm-hmm.
We would say, that's not really democratic. That doesn't seem right.
Sure.
Like, because the idea of majority rule conflicts with another founding principle of modern democracy, which is rule of law, right? That everybody should be treated the same or under the law.
Right.
And that's just one kind of quick example. And again, this is the reason why we associate these two conflicting things with the same concept. Democracy has to do with the fact that democracy has evolved and its meaning over time.
Absolutely.
But before we move to that, I guess I do want to answer your question more specifically.
Okay.
Because there are some misconceptions. And I think the biggest one is the misconception that democracy necessarily means capitalism, or that capitalism and democracy necessarily go together, or these two concepts get conflated, right? This idea that democracy means that you must have free and open markets, right? And that's not true.
Well, they can be in conflict a lot of the time.
Right, and it's not true in both directions, right? Like there are a lot of capitalist systems that are authoritarian, and those do really well. Meaning, in other words, a capitalist economic regime can support an authoritarian political regime just as much as it can support a democratic political regime.
Oh, absolutely.
And vice versa. You can have functioning democracies that are not that don't have really free open markets, right? And a lot of young democracies tend not to. They tend to have more regulated markets, and so we call those social democracies.
Yeah.
So your listeners who may be fans of Bernie Sanders are familiar with the concept of social democracy, right? But it's a democracy.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not that it's not that advocates like Bernie Sanders are opposed to markets. They're just saying that you need to have regulated markets. So my point is just it's important not to conflate economic regimes with political regimes.
Right. It's two separate
things.
Yeah.
They can be mixed and matched in different ways. In the real world, they are. So that's one misconception.
Okay.
Another misconception is that democracies are necessarily more efficient administratively or more easily governed. This may sound odd, probably a lot of people, but because obviously that's not true, right?
Well, I mean, we see this with people advocating for China's type system where they say, look, they can get things done. If they want to address climate change, they just
Right. No,
go at it.
Right. I think it's pretty clear that authoritarian regimes are actually more efficient administratively, but there are other reasons why you may or may not choose them. But anyway, that's one, and I guess the last thing I would say is, some students might have the misconception that all democracies kind of work the same and are structured the same and function the same, and they really don't. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can structure democracies,
right?
And they can function very differently.
Yeah, and that stuff we'll get into next week and the week after when we talk about the institutions and the different case studies of how different legislators work and things like that. Okay, so getting into this issue of defining democracy. So really, we come with two concepts. You've got kind of the minimalist or procedural or electoral definition, and then you have the maximalist or liberal democratic definition.
And there's actually a third, which is the classical definition.
And the classical definition, which Schumpeter talks about. Do you want to talk about that real quick?
I think so. I sense you're going towards the difference between minimalist and maximalist definitions. And if we're going to go there, I think it's important, or it might be easier to first talk about the classical definition, because the minimalist definition, as the reading by Schumpeter shows, was really developed in opposition or as a reaction to the classical definition, which had held for thousands of years, right up until modern times, meaning the last couple of, in our
so
centuries.
Going all the way back to ancient Greece.
From ancient Greece all the way through the founding of the United States and our founding fathers, all the way up to the 1960s. They were pretty much democracy was held by kind of like this classical definition. And that's why the Schumpeter reading was so revolutionary at the time, or the 50s, let's say, right?
Sure.
Where where that's when we really start to see the development of what we think now of as modern definitions of democracies. And then the maximalist definition came as a reaction to the minimalist definition. So it's kind of like, it might make sense to talk about them.
So it's almost like they happen in stages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they did happen in stages
And build
for
upon
logical reasons because they were developed in reaction to
each other.
to each other.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, but the classical definition says what exactly?
Yeah, so the classical definition really goes back to Aristotle, right? And it's important to emphasize that the point of Aristotle's work to try to define different regimes, as we would call them, was he had this normative, meaning moral endeavor to try to figure out what's the best way you could structure a society, right? Mm-hmm. And it's important to keep that in mind because his answer is shaped by that, right?
Yeah.
And so for him, he's trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way to structure a society? And by that raises the question of, well, what's best? Like, what's good?
Right. How do you define best?
How you define best and how you define good. And for Aristotle, the idea was that, well, the regime that's going to produce the best common good, right? And you can see why that's then why this is important for Schumpeter's reaction, right?
Right.
So up until, really modern times, there was this assumption that political regimes should be designed in a way to try to provide for the common good, collective good. And there was this assumption that you could try to distill from people like the common interest.
Sure.
Right? And so a lot of people probably won't be aware of the fact that for Aristotle, the way he defined democracy was actually ruled by the poor, not ruled by the majority. Well, and the poor were the majority.
Right. And
so,
he wasn't a fan of what he called
democracy. And democracy was considered to be it was one of his, I forgot the term he uses, but it's like a problematic regime, right, type. It was not, so he had these three good types of regimes, and he had these three perverted regimes, I think is the term he used, right? And so democracy was a perverted regime, meaning it was unstable. It was going to always devolve into
a strongman,
demagogue. Yeah, this idea, right? And so for Aristotle, when he looked at all the different constitutions in the Greek city-states, and so he was one of the first comparative political scientists in that way, right? He used the comparative method to try to figure that out, answer this research question. And what he noticed, or one of the first things he concluded, is that it really matters, whether or not the poor are in charge or the rich are in charge. That really, he saw societies as fundamentally structured along class lines, right? And that you could, right? And so he defined regimes where you had rule by the rich as aristocracies or oligarchies. Well, you had. I don't want to get too much into the details of Aristotle, but you had kind of like a perverted version of what might happen if just sort of the rich ruled only in their interest, and that would be an oligarchy. But if you then had enlightened rich people who tried to rule on behalf of the common good, then that would be an aristocracy. And that's what he thought was actually
like your philosopher king.
Yeah, you had the philosopher king, right, as his ideal. That was his ideal best regime. Right. But it's unrealistic because, how many great philosopher kings do you get? Right. So the next best is like aristocracy, right? Mm-hmm. And then the perverted version of that is an oligarchy, where you just have the rich essentially ruling for their behalf at the expense of the poor majority. Mm-hmm. And then you had democracy was ruled by the poor majority in their own interest at the expense,
at the expense of people that have money and resources. Right.
And so it got, over time, it's been associated with rule by the majority, but it's only because in every society, the poor are the majority, right? So for then thousands of years, including up through the founding of the United States, the democracy was not considered to be a good regime type that you should strive to have, right? Like the founding fathers, if you read the Federalist Papers and others, were concerned about that, right? They were concerned about mob rule, which is what democracy was thought to devolve into. And the problem they said was that, poor people are driven by their like ids, right? The animal instincts is what Aristotle called them. Their passions, right?
Right.
Because often they're struggling to meet basic needs. And so you will have some charismatic leader that the Greeks called a demagogue, who would come in and just inflame the passions of the poor masses, convincing them that they're doing things in their own interest, when in reality he or she is just mobilizing them in the interests of the demagogue. And so democracies would inevitably devolve into authoritarian, tyranny, ruled by like some tyrant. Until the masses turned on the tyrant and tore them down, and then you'd have like an unstable. And so it would just be this unstable cycle of conflict, right, between mob rule and violence and, tyrants, essentially, right? So the founding fathers of the United States Constitution recognized, so they consciously didn't structure the U.S. as a classical democracy. They structured it as a republic, right?
Right.
And most students kind of know the difference between that. Well,
should know that, or at least come across it
right. And the point being that you don't let. So Aristotle recognized that he said, look, it's going to be problematic to have just aristocrats ruling in their own interest, and the poor are going to be useless. In a stable regime, you actually need to have some way for both of those classes to participate and have some stake in the regime to survive, right, to be stable. Right. And so he called that a mixed regime, right? And that's the ideal thing. We now call those republics, right? So our founding fathers were classical Renaissance men, and they read a lot about this, and they came to agree with Aristotle's conclusion that you needed some sort of mixed regime. They called it a republic, right? Where you give the people some say in a directly elected lower house, our House of Representatives. But there's checks on that, because it was fully expected that the House of Representatives would be a bunch of rabble-rousing troublemakers who would want, no taxes and lots of government services, right?
Yep.
And so the idea is that you needed to have wealthy, enlightened thinkers to check that, and that was supposed to be in the Senate, right? And so originally the Senate was not directly elected, and it was supposed to be wise, wealthy sages, who could stall the House, the passion, dampen the flames of passion from the House, right?
Right.
And similarly, their worst nightmare of the founding fathers would be this idea that you would have that the passion of the majority of citizens could be inflamed to elect a demagogue as president. I didn't think people should be able to directly elect presidents, because they were concerned with what Aristotle described, and so they created the Electoral College,
right,
specifically for it, because there was this idea that you would have wealthy, enlightened thinkers who would be less likely to be swayed by their passions, to that if the people wanted to elect some charismatic demagogue, they would say, no, we're going to not do that, and we're, of course, that system sort of decayed over time, where we have the Electoral College just quickly became a stamp for. Anyway, but that's
right.
But my point is trying to explain why democracy was seen as a form of tyranny, and and that's important, and that what's happened is that the definition of tyranny has changed over time. It used to be that the major form of tyranny that people were concerned about were like the masses, mob rule, right? Who would trample on the rights and freedoms of people, and would just kind of lead to instability and conflict. And so, but now in our modern definition, that's not tyranny. Tyranny is
the opposite.
The opposite, right? Tyranny is now defined in the modern era as limitations of freedom by the state or by the government, or just like a handful of people who control, right? And our modern definitions of democracy are now really kind of what was originally thought of as a republic, right? These, and that's why these elements of a republic that were meant to protect against the classical elements of democracy, like rule of law, checks and balances across different branches of government, rights, protection of minority rights, constitutionalism that will protect certain freedoms and enhance political rights. Those are now fundamental elements of modern democracy, but would have been considered anti-democratic according to classical definitions. And I'll give you a quick example of that. Which would be judicial review. And that's the last thing I'll say on this, right? So this idea of judicial review, this idea that you have checks and balances between the executive, that the judiciary, the courts, could, if the legislature, which is supposed to represent the people,
right,
passed a law that clearly discriminated or violated the rights of some segment of society, that the courts could come in and say, no, that law is unconstitutional because the Constitution says, has the rule of law that you have to provide equal rights to everybody. In our country, it's the Bill of Rights, right?
Right.
This idea that an handful of unelected individuals who are essentially enforcing an agreement that was made by people maybe 200 years ago will now restrict the ability of a present generation to decide how they want to rule themselves would be considered undemocratic by Aristotle's standard. But it's a core definition of what we consider to be democratic today.
Right. Well, I mean, it fits right in with rule of law, which
right.
is one of law. It is the rule of law.
It is the rule of law.
Yeah.
So now in modern democracy, you have kind of three elements. You've got to have competition among elites, for who's going to represent the people and make decisions in a representative fashion. You've got to have real free and fair competition for that leadership role. And you've got to have then the rule of law, meaning all segments of society are sort of treated equally under the law and no segment of society is above the law. Again, it's the idea of checks on power by the state. And that you've got to have rights and liberties in order to ensure the full participation in politics by any segment of society. You can't sort of have some groups unable to participate.
Okay, so that's what we've come to.
That's what we've come to now.
Those three elements.
Yeah, those three elements.
If we go back to the
minimalist,
the minimalist or the procedural definition, so it basically says that all you need is free and fair elections.
Yeah,
and you're a democracy if that's the case. If there's free competition, so how does that then lead to what we consider democracy today?
Yeah. Well, the last question seems different from the first.
Okay.
In other words, how did we get there question? In other words, why do we get the change? Is that, or?
I guess...
well, let me point out two things.
Okay.
One thing is that modern definitions of democracy are really concerned with freedom. So the reason why we have this switch is because what we think of democracy is the regime that kind of evolved in the UK over many hundreds of years gradually. And it evolved that way because of this ideology of liberalism that evolved over centuries. And I mean liberalism in the capital L, where
right,
freedom. It's an ideology that espouses freedom. So open markets, free markets,
free thought,
freedom of speech,
things like that.
Protection against arbitrary rule by monarchs, right?
So rule of law.
So rule of law, right? And so you get in the UK, right? You get the Magna Carta. You get over time get the evolution of these ideas that you should have checks and balance. You should have constraints on the monarch, the sovereign. And you do that by protections for individual liberty. Everybody should be, rule of law and that sort of thing.
Sure.
To do that, then you have to have then some participation in decision making over important, right? And so in the UK, you gradually get the House of Nobles, the
House of Lords.
House of Lords, right? The nobles get together and say, well, we want to say in how much we're taxed, right?
Right.
And then over time, after you get a middle class, you have then wealthy non-nobles saying, well, we're the merchants. We're actually making money. Like, we also want to say in trade policy and how we're taxed. And you get the House of Commons, right? And so anyway, because of that, we have this association now that liberalism and democracy kind of go together hand in hand and are kind of the same thing. That's the story of how you get this modern notion of liberal democracy that's really based around freedom and rule of law and that sort of thing. The minimalist definition comes out. The Schumpeter piece kind of really highlights how that happened, right? Schumpeter is really the first one to question this idea that there really is a common good that democracy can elicit, or you should try, right? Schumpeter was an economist by training, and he did a bunch of really interesting research on marketing, advertisement, right? And he's the first one to question this. A lot of people assume that marketers just give the consumers what they want, and they're just telling advertisements are just a reflection of the common will or desire of people, right? And Schumpeter was like, no, people don't actually really know what they want. Marketers create perceptions of desire through marketing and advertisement, right? Like, and that's probably an idea that we can relate to, right? Like that, any parent knows that that's true, right? You don't let your kids watch anyway, there's a reason why they put the candy shelf in the grocery store right by the checkout aisle, right? Like,
absolutely.
Anyway, so he also then sees relevance to the political realm, right? And says, you know what? It's also not true that there's this collective interest that elected representatives or the elites in society are going to reflect. It's the opposite, actually. Elites in society who control the media and are going to essentially tell people what their interests are, right? In today's world, I think people can see that, right? Conservatives will tune in to conservative talk radio and Fox, and liberals will tune in to The Daily Show and MSNBC or whatever.
NPR.
And whatever. And we learn what we learn what we're interested in and what we could get, right? Like that. And so Schumpeter says, well, if that's true, then there's really no common good. It's really just, and Pravorsky sort of expands on it, says, democracy isn't about trying to kind of develop some common good. We should just accept the fact that it's really just a conflict resolution mechanism. It's a way to try to channel elite rivalry for control through a nonviolent mechanism.
Right.
Right, and that's really what it is. And so elections are useful as a way to make transparent who's got more support.
Yeah, I think he gives the example of it. You're basically taking all the supporters of one side and all the supporters of the other, and you can see who has bigger numbers, that if there eventually was a conflict, here's who would win.
And the key to a procedural democracy like that is that elites will only participate, right? So the alternative is war, right? Conflict, or you just divide into two separate states and each take your, you either have civil war or you divide into separate states and each one gets to control their territory, right?
Right.
So if that's the alternative, then the question is, why would elites agree to share power, right? That's really the question. And there's kind of two answers to that in the procedural sense, which is one is they've got to believe they're part of the same national identity, right? And so the idea of just separating and kind of have their own isn't acceptable because they see themselves as part of the same national project. And then they've got to see themselves, so given that, they've got to either duke it out or share power. And the elites have to get to the point where they feel they've got more to win by agreeing to common set of rules that they'll all play by, that they think are fair, rather than, right? And democracy, in the modern sense, rests on this fragile perception of trust that all sides will play fairly by the same rules. And if that decays, the whole house of cards crumbles, basically.
So in that sense, it kind of creates stability when they buy into this power sharing that I'll have a chance in the future.
Yeah, right. So if I lose this time around, I'll agree to accept the loss because in 4 years, I believe that if I win in 4 years, that you'll abide by the rules and allow me to rule. I'll get my chance later, right? So there is a certain amount of like social trust that has to be there for that. And the elections provide, they tell the losers, look, if you're going to take it to the streets, the other side's going to have more, if it really goes to that, which group, it kind of sort of makes transparent which group's going to have more support and is likely to win. It also tells the winner that, hey, if you just, you can't just, because you won, you can't just simply now use your power to change the rules to consolidate your power so that there's no,
because then when the power switches, then those that get into power after that, they get to use all of the
it's
things.
A warning. The election is supposed to be a warning to those who win that if you use your power to just consolidate your rule so that there's no more free and fair elections, that the opposition has a sizable enough constituency that they can have a formidable resistance. So the idea is it makes transparent how much support each side has, and the idea is that no side, hopefully elections show that no side has, again, sort of reinforces this perception that both sides or all sides are better off playing within the system and living to play another day than to try to defect.
Right.
And that's why elections are important, and that's why you focus on the procedure of elections.
And why competition is
important.
Okay, so we have this procedural definition of democracy, but is that really it? Like, if we're going to, it seems like they're leaving quite a bit out based on what we talked about earlier and based on what we think democracy is.
And when you push people like Zavorsky on this, they will, of course, immediately admit that, to have real competition, that does imply participation, right? Like you can't have real competition if some people can't participate. That's not really competitive.
Well, and it also implies rule of law.
And it implies rule of law, right? So you get, but the problem is if that brings up criticisms by people like Larry Diamond, who said, look, the reason why people like Zavorsky say the procedural minimalist definition is useful is because you can structure democracies all different kinds of ways, and countries do, right? And if you want to if you want to understand why are some countries democratic and others are not, you've got to be able to measure clearly in an objective way which countries are democratic and which ones are not, right?
Right.
And because you can structure democracies, democracies may have a whole bunch of different qualities that you're better off with a kind of a minimalist, simple definition, if that's your goal. And you need, in order to have precise measurements, and researchers want to have precise measurements that you can have, The problem with that, and so that's well and good, and that's a good reason, and that's why people do that. The problem is, of course, that if you do that, we know that there are all kinds of countries out there that have competitive, free and fair elections, but that have qualities that just don't sit right with us, that we think of as undemocratic. Right? So, for example, there are, during the 70s, there were all these regimes in Latin America where you would have free and fair elections among multiple parties, where the parties rotated office, different parties won over time, but they weren't really democratic because whoever won the election, they didn't really have power, that they were just puppets of the military who were pulling the strings behind the scenes, right? So, one of the criteria, people like Diamond say, look, you've got to have all of the things that the minimalist definition says, but on top of that, you have to have some other qualities. Including you can't have a situation where you have unaccountable, unelected people holding power, manipulating by, that might be the military. And that's why civilian control of the military is now considered by many, by advocates of liberal democracy, to be a necessary criteria.
Mm-hmm.
Given the current news, about Trump's, and the anonymous review in the New York Times, it's maybe worth noting that, another fear has always been, unelected bureaucrats running the show behind the scenes, right? And that's why, allegations that Trump's staff is actually running things without,
Right.
subverting his authority. That's undemocratic by the modern definition of a liberal democracy for that reason.
Yeah.
Right, and then there are, you could have, again, free and fair competitive elections, but if you don't allow African Americans to vote, as the U.S. did not for many
Yeah, definitely.
decades,
Or
if you
women,
or women,
yeah.
right? Or if you, in other words, like if you have large segments of your population that can't participate, that
Mm-hmm.
that's not going to be captured in the procedural procedural measurements explicitly. You could have similarly, you could have free and fair elections and everybody participate, meaning everybody's eligible to vote and everybody's eligible to run for office. But if the government restricts freedom of speech and freedom of assembly such that they can harass opposition parties, such that they can't really campaign, they can't,
Well, then the competition aspect
Then the
is
competition-
really gone. Or
yeah,
it's
procedurally
diminished.
it can be there, but in reality it's diminished, right? And that's kind of the point of the maximalist advocates of the maximalist definition, which is this focus on these minimal procedures hide. You can measure it in a way that will look like it's fully democratic in a procedural sense, but in reality it's not functioning the way we know democracies should function. Mm-hmm. And that's why they say you've got to also measure protections of civil liberties, protections for political rights, horizontal accountability, not just vertical accountability.
Okay,
in other words,
go into these because Diamond talks about them, and I think it's important to understand the different ways accountability works.
Yeah, so everyone agrees, meaning both minimalists and maximalists agree that you've got to have vertical accountability. This idea that what that means is average people are able to somehow hold accountable the say the president or that elected representatives mm-hmm. have to be held accountable to their voters, right? Now minimalists would say, well, you can just do that, that's what elections essentially do. Maximalists would say, not really, because you can have a lot of regimes, as have existed in Latin America and others, where, you have elections, elected representatives get elected, and there's maybe rotation in office between parties. But once they're in power, the elected leaders don't do anything to represent the interests of the voters. They just enrich themselves. They're corrupt. They engage in crony capitalism, right? And you get in this cycle where voters, get mad at the crony capitalists or the corrupt politicians from one party and vote party Y. Party Y gets in power, and then they get mad at the corrupt, unrepresentative parties in party Y, and so they vote for party X. And you have these swings back and forth, but in reality, the population's like, screw all you guys. Like, none of you are representing my interests.
Yeah.
Right. These are known as partyocracies. Right, and so there's this notion that you've got to have accountability mechanisms in between elections. Like, it's not enough to just,
if elections are only every 2 years or every 4 years, there has to be something in between those intervals.
And for accountability to happen, you've got to have transparency. People have to know mm-hmm. what's actually happening, which is why, free, independent media is considered to be a foundation of democracy. If there isn't a common set of truths that's transparent about what's happening that people know about, there's no way to hold leaders accountable. You can't have this vertical accountability. It all breaks down, which is why there's so much concern about attacks on the independent media.
Right.
Not only here in the United States, but around the world right now.
Yeah.
And so then horizontal accountability is this idea that there's got to be accountability between different branches of government in order to constrain executive power, so that you don't just have executives, presidents or prime ministers, who just, again, sort of it devolves into what's called a delegative democracy, where they're elected through free and fair elections, but once in office, they just start ruling by decree and whim, and
Yeah, well, and that kind of goes back to the Supreme Court,
Right.
or the judicial review,
right?
Yeah.
So that horizontal accountability can be structured in different ways in different democratic regimes. You don't have to have judicial review as the only way. There are some democracies like the UK that don't have judicial review, but they build in horizontal accountability in other ways, which I'm sure you'll get to in the class, like through the votes of no confidence and things like that. But increasingly, most regimes are now having some sort of judicial review.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, I think that
Enough?
covered quite a bit. I know that you're tight on time here, and we should probably get you out. But thanks for coming on, and hopefully this is useful to everybody that listens.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right.
Bye.
Welcome to The Populist. This